The sixth generation of video game consoles was something of a renaissance for survival horror games. Having finally moved past the awkward beginnings of 3D game presentation and controls, gaming moved into its three-dimensional adolescence, bringing us an ambitious, inventive, and diverse collection of games that further refined what games could do and be, warts and all. Silent Hill evolved to what many now consider its peak form. Resident Evil began the shift toward action horror so well that nothing could follow in its footsteps effectively for another generation or so, and the Fatal Frame trilogy came from nowhere to dominate scariest games of all time lists for a solid decade before just kind of disappearing off the map. There would be only 2 more games in the series after this trilogy, both of which wouldn't make it out of Japan until later on. Nearly a decade and a half later in the case of Fatal Frame 4. But for a while in the mid-aughts, any discussion of horror games inevitably included one of the true monarchs of the genre, a game so diabolical and terrifying that no one escaped the experience without nightmares. For a while, Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly reigned supreme. Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Fatal Frame is still my favorite horror series. The games take haunted house horror to a new level, with unique gameplay systems that feed into the horror better than most any game I've played. It's a masterclass in the fixed camera angle format, which I'll still defend even after this series sadly abandoned it. Its understanding of cinematic language, both in and out of cutscenes, is a sight to behold, and while they show their age in a few conspicuous ways, the overall presentation nevertheless manages to feel fairly timeless. I can't say as much for the series after the original trilogy, because 4 is only set to make it stateside a few months after this video goes up, and 5 is fine. It's pretty good, but it's not nearly on the same level as the originals. The first 3 Fatal Frame games stand as my favorite horror games, which is why I talk about one of them every Halloween. Yeah, I kind of missed the boat on that one this time. But while the third is my personal favorite, Fatal Frame 2 is the one that most consider to be the best by a fairly wide margin. Its reputation as a stellar sequel and an unparalleled horror experience is nearly unmatched. So today, we're going to talk about it. How it tells its story, how it achieves its incredible scares, and most importantly for our purposes, what that story means. As always, I'm going to be talking about that story in great detail, so spoilers for both this game and the previous one abound. I highly recommend playing them before watching the video, but unfortunately, at the time of this video's release at least, they're pretty hard to get a hold of. They're available on the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, but those are very expensive to purchase, so the only accessible and legal option for getting these games is to purchase them digitally on the PS3. Which is unfortunate, because while both versions are fantastic, the Xbox version includes some minor gameplay improvements as well as an extra ending and is generally considered the better of the 2 original versions of the game. There is also a remake on the Nintendo Wii, a remake, if you will, but don't. In my humble opinion, don't play that one. Also, content warning, this game deals with stuff like trauma, death, suicide, and twin side? Sibling side? Sorry, just a second. I'm gonna look this up real quick. Sororicide. Huh. Look, the point is there's a lot of death and it gets pretty dark, so just, heads up. So, without further ado, let's go over the story of Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly and see what this game has to say about loneliness, trauma, and familial love. Mio and Mayu are twin sisters who are visiting a forest they used to play in as kids. The area will soon be underwater due to the construction of a new dam, and they're visiting it one last time. It's not all positive memories, though. While playing here as children, Mayu fell while chasing Mio and hurt her leg, permanently affecting her ability to walk. Mayu feels more dependent on her sister than ever, while Mio still struggles with guilt over the incident. Now, while revisiting the site, Mayu follows a crimson butterfly and the twins wander into an old village called All Gods Village. It quickly becomes apparent that the village was the site of something terrible, and the spirits of the dead still linger. The player takes control of Mio as she finds the Camera Obscura, a camera that can exorcise ghosts, and uses it to defend against the spirits of enraged villagers. Mayu wanders off again, almost in a trance of some kind, prompting Mio to search for her. What follows is a journey through the village in search of Mayu and a way out, visiting the homes of the village's 4 main families and discovering the history of this village in much the same way as the first game, through notes left by its residents, ghosts of important figures, and the constant threat of a ghost named Sae. Which means it's time to delve into the backstory of Fatal Frame 2, which comprises much of the story itself. Like the first game, the narrative framework here is surprisingly Soulsian for when the game came out, but this one is a bit more explicit about the events that take place during the game itself than the first one was. There's a lot of detail to get into here, but I'll try and cover the most relevant bits. All Gods Village is the site of a gate to the underworld, referred to as the Hellish Abyss by folklorists, but only by an asterisk by the villagers, who consider it taboo to say or write its name. The villagers were tasked with keeping the spirits of the Hellish Abyss appeased so they wouldn't swarm out of it. To this end, the Crimson Sacrifice was performed on a regular basis. All Gods Village had an inordinate amount of twins born, and local belief was that twins were actually a single soul, just split into 2 upon birth. The Crimson Sacrifice acts to reunite the 2 halves of the soul by having one twin strangle the other and cast their body into the Hellish Abyss, thus appeasing the Abyss and reuniting the dead twin's soul with the living one, referred to henceforth as the Remaining. The sacrificed twin, it was believed, would transform into a crimson butterfly, a guardian deity that would forevermore protect the village. This seems to have gone smoothly for the village's long history, but at some point, things started going wrong. Specifically with the sacrifice of Mutsuki Tachibana by his brother Itsuki. The ritual went like normal, but didn't appease the Hellish Abyss. Exactly why isn't explicitly stated, but there is a note suggesting that the ritual's success relies on the twins not being too emotionally close, and it's clear from other parts of the game that Itsuki and Mutsuki loved each other very much. In any case, the ritual failed, which meant other steps had to be taken. The village's head priest and ceremony master, Ryokan Kurosawa, was the father of the only twins left in the village, Yae and Sae. He seemed hesitant to put his own daughters through the sacrifice, possibly because he was a remaining himself and knew the trauma it caused, but he ultimately gave in and prepared Yae and Sae for the ritual in which Yae would kill her own twin sister. However, upon finding out that his friends would soon go through the same thing he did, Itsuki Tachibana wrote a letter to a friend of his, Ryozo Munakata, a young man who had traveled through the village with his parents as a child. Itsuki was clearly distressed and asked Ryozo to get Yae and Sae out of the village, so Ryozo asked his mentor, a folklorist named Seijiro Makabe, to travel to the village with him. The 2 were greeted hospitably by the head priest and introduced to Yae and Sae, but Itsuki was kept from Ryozo, and the villagers told him that Itsuki and Mutsuki had died of some kind of illness. Itsuki had tried to give Ryozo a way to find him, giving the key to his room to his sister Chitose, but Chitose had also been traumatized by the death of her brother Mutsuki and hid in fear when Ryozo came to the house. Just a quick aside, it's genuinely impressive how well the game interweaves the events of this backstory with the modern setting where Mio and Mayu were trapped in the village. In the backstory, Chitose's fear of Ryozo is a catalyst in the tragedy to follow, since it complicates Ryozo's attempts to rescue Yae and Sae and keeps him from talking to Itsuki at all. But it also factors into the game itself, because Chitose's ghost still holds the key in her hiding place, and at one point the player must recover it from her to get into Itsuki's room. The game's backstory makes up a significant portion of the game's overall narrative content and informs Mio and Mayu's current predicament, but it also interacts directly with what the player is actually doing in the game, adding meaningful context to what could otherwise be mistaken as simple fetch quest design. This was true of the first game to some extent, but it is far more prevalent and well executed here. Yae and Sae soon realize that their father plans to use the visiting folklorist in another ritual, the Kusabi ritual. Kusabi literally means wedge, and the ritual exists to briefly appease the Hellish Abyss and buy time for the full Crimson Sacrifice to fully satiate it. It involves torturing an outsider before dropping them into the Abyss, and since the twins had come to like Seijiro and Ryozo, they didn't want this to happen to them. They tipped off Seijiro, telling him he had to get out, but the folklorist's curiosity got the better of him, and he simply told Ryozo to go instead. Ryozo did as he was asked, but promised Yae that he would return to help her and Sae escape. Seijiro was indeed tortured and sacrificed to buy time, but before the night of the actual Crimson Sacrifice, Itsuki showed Yae and Sae a path out of the village, telling them to go on while he attempted to distract and mislead the villagers who were sent out to look for them. Unfortunately, the twins weren't exactly of one mind about all this. While Yae was determined to get out, Sae felt an obligation to the village and feared being separated from her sister. As they ran from the village, Sae threw herself off the path, expecting that Yae would come back for her and they would be brought back to the village, forced to participate in the sacrifice and, in a sense, be together forever, reunited as one soul. But Yae didn't stop for her. Sae was captured and returned to the village alone, and Itsuki was locked up for his part in her attempted escape. Sae waited, confident that Yae would return for her, but her sister never came. In desperation, Sae's father eventually decided their only option was to sacrifice Sae alone. Itsuki, despairing that he had been once again unable to save those he cared about, hung himself within his prison on the night of the ritual, and Sae was hung and thrown into the hellish abyss in a desperate gamble to appease it. It didn't work. Instead, much like Himuro Mansion in the first game, malice spewed forth from the abyss, killing everyone in the village and turning the spirits there, past and present, into vengeful ghosts. This event was called the Repentance. As for Yae, it's unclear whether she intentionally left Sae behind when she fell, but what we do know is that she had actually intended to return for her. But she became lost, and by the time she found her way back to the village, the repentance had already taken place.
I'm so sorry.
Ryozo found her then, and brought her out of the forest to safety. Players of the first game, or viewers of my video on the first game, may recognize the names Ryozo and Yae, because they eventually married and moved to Himuro Mansion, where they both met tragic ends detailed in the backstory of the first Fatal Frame. I don't think the first Fatal Frame was made with this backstory for them in mind, because this knowledge doesn't really do much to enhance either of these two games, but fun fact. There are a few other stories in the background of Fatal Frame 2, but that's pretty much what we need to know in order to understand the story as a whole, so we'll get to the other stuff later. For now, let's get back to Mio and Mayu. Mio eventually finds Mayu again, but over time it becomes clear that Mayu is possessed by the vengeful ghost of Sae, who expresses regret that they had tried to run, and resentment at Yae for leaving her alone and indirectly getting everyone killed by causing the ritual to fail. The repeating process of finding and losing Mayu takes Mio through the village, learning of its history and facing the spirits of those lost within it, until she eventually secures a way to escape it. But by this point, Mayu is deeply within the thrall of Sae's ghost, and when the two are separated by the ghosts of enraged villagers, Mio has the opportunity to escape without Mayu. If the player takes this opportunity, they get one of the game's endings, wherein Mio leaves her sister behind and escapes through the tunnels. But upon hearing Mayu's voice, she turns to see the ghost of Sae coming for her. She awakes by the river, where she and Mayu were talking at the beginning of the game, but now she's alone. As with the first game, there are multiple endings to Fatal Frame 2, only one of which is actually considered canon. Unsurprisingly, this isn't it. Instead, Mio goes back for Mayu, returning to the Kurosawa house where Yae and Sae had lived and descending to the site of these horrible rituals. The entrance includes doors that will only open when the two twins approach both doors at once, but the spirit of Yae lets Mayu in.
I'm sorry. Let's do this together.
When Mio follows, Sae's spirit does the same for her.
You finally come for me. I kept waiting and waiting.
Mio fights her way through the spirits of the mourners, criminals who were blinded by gazing into the abyss and now serve to facilitate the Crimson Sacrifice ritual, and eventually defeats the enraged spirit of Seijiro, the folklorist who was sacrificed as the Kusabi. Finally, Mio arrives at the hellish abyss itself, where Mayu waits for her. The ghosts of the priests hit their staves on the ground. Mayu guides Mio's hands to her throat, and the ritual commences.
Kill me.
And thus we see the true origin of the Crimson Butterfly, the marks left on the throat of a child ritually murdered by their twin. Seeming to snap out of some kind of trance and realize what she's done, Mio is understandably distraught, and when Mayu's spirit emerges from the abyss as a crimson butterfly, she follows it to the exit of the village, sobbing and apologizing the whole way as the spirits of the damned are released, and the sun rises in All God's village for the first time since the repentance. After the credits, we see Mio sitting on a bench, alone, overlooking the now flooded site of All God's village, and we see that she too has the mark of the crimson butterfly on her throat. That is the canonical ending, the one referenced in the events of Fatal Frame 3, the one considered to have happened in the larger story of the Fatal Frame games. Now, in the first game, I didn't spend a lot of time on the alternate ending because, frankly, it didn't add a lot. It mostly just reinforced the themes of the original and didn't change much about how we understand what happened. But Fatal Frame 2 is a little different on that front, so let's talk about the other endings. If the player finishes the game on a harder difficulty, Mio must actually fight Mayu after the Kusabi, after which the spirit of Sae falls from her and plunges into the abyss. Mio catches Mayu, but in holding her over the edge, she glimpses the depths of the hellish abyss, and just as the mourners did, she loses her sight. We then see the two of them sometime later, overlooking the waters that cover the village, as Mayu helps to lead her sightless sister away. Normally, I have a policy to only cover the content of the game I am talking about as it was on release. So no DLC, no sequels, no other media like books or movies. This is mostly to keep the analysis from getting bogged down in extraneous details that were added later. I just want to talk about this story and what it means without needing to deal with the occasionally contradictory and sometimes kind of convoluted details of things added after the fact. But I'm gonna break that rule this time. I don't really like doing that, but ultimately it is a rule that I made up, and I can break it if I think it's going to improve and deepen our understanding of the story more than it just complicates it. And the Xbox version of Fatal Frame 2, released only a year after the original PlayStation 2 version, includes an alternate ending that I think really changes a lot about how we interpret and understand this story and its meaning. Mio arrives at the hellish abyss just in time to see Mayu approaching it, but before she can get to her, the spirit of Yae emerges from her own body. Yae and Sae speak for the first time since the latter's sacrifice, and the two join hands and jump into the abyss together, creating their own crimson butterfly. Mio holds on to Mayu, pulling her from the abyss, and the souls of all who were victimized by the village watch as the village's guardians swarm into the sky. Mio and Mayu finally confront what's been driving a wedge between them as the sun rises on All God's village. There are also two endings created for the Wii version, Deep Crimson Butterfly, but they're bad. I mentioned before that I don't really like the remake, and these endings are not the only reason why, but they're a not insignificant portion of it. So that is Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. We have plenty to talk about, but before we start getting into story and themes and such, let's talk once again about how the Fatal Frame series uses its ingenious gameplay to accentuate both its story and its horror. The uniqueness of Fatal Frame's gameplay isn't just in the gameplay itself, but the role it plays in making the game as famously scary as it is. It could have simply gotten by on its oppressive atmosphere, creepy sound design, and disturbing ghosts, but it took things a step further by— Okay, that's my script for the first game. Let me try again. The uniqueness of Fatal Frame's gameplay isn't just in the gameplay itself, but the role it plays in making the game as famously scary as it is. Yeah, this is one of the best things about Fatal Frame 2, but it's also something the first game pretty much already perfected. I don't know what I can say that I didn't already say in my previous Fatal Frame video. Fatal Frame 2 makes a number of gameplay improvements, of course, but most of them are iterative and fairly minor, with the significant exception of switching the right and left sticks while looking through the camera, since the two-stick first-person control scheme hadn't been popularized by the time the first game came out, so the left stick moved the camera and the right stick moved the character. But while Alien Resurrection introduced the dual-stick first-person control scheme we all know today in the year 2000, it was Halo that popularized it a year later, and Fatal Frame released only a month after that. So it's understandable that the first game didn't use what would soon become a universal standard, but I'm glad the second game adjusted to fit the new norm. But this video is on story and meaning, and while that gameplay change is an important and welcome one, it has no bearing on how the gameplay contributes to the horror and themes of the game. The player still has to stare down the ghosts in first person to defeat them, and that still contributes metaphorically to both the core of the game's horror, undiscovered terrors that must be investigated and understood to be survived, as well as the game's themes of folklore and hidden histories. If you want to hear more about how Fatal Frame's gameplay offers some of the most terrifying and thematically significant mechanics in the horror genre, check out my video on the previous game, because there's little I have to say here that I didn't already say there, and I don't feel like making the same video twice any more than you feel like watching it. But there is one deceptively minor change that can be interpreted to have a lot of meaning. In the first game, the camera gathered power the longer it remained trained on a ghost, symbolizing the care and study with which one must approach hidden truths to fully understand them. But in Fatal Frame 2, the camera's shots are more powerful the closer the player gets to an enemy ghost. It's a minor difference, but still a notable one. It carries a similar meaning, but emphasizes closeness above all, which in a game as much about togetherness as this carries no small degree of thematic relevance. So it's time to get into more detail about the game's themes, but in order to do that, I'm gonna have to do something I don't usually do. I've said many times that this channel is not about theory making, but I'm gonna have to do some theory making for this one. So at least give me a moment to talk about why I don't usually do that and why I feel I need to make an exception for this one. Back in 2019, YouTuber Dan Olson coined the phrase, "no meaning, only lore," to describe the critical approach that became so common through shows like game theory and the discourse surrounding games like Dark Souls. It's a critical attitude that treats art like a puzzle to be solved rather than a vehicle for communicating meaning. It seeks to explain a story, but not to dig into it, not to interpret it, not to find meaning in it. Because there is no meaning in this framework. Only lore, only facts, only a series of events, characters, and details that form an empty account with no substance. A lot of blame falls on Dark Souls for the popularization of this approach that Olson so eloquently labeled, but in all fairness, I don't think it's Dark Souls' fault so much as the way people latched onto it. The Souls games are packed with meaning if you look for it, but a lot of people don't. Most take its narrative structure as a challenge and reduce it to the sum of its parts rather than looking for the meaning contained in all that lore. All that to say, I don't make these videos to explain to you what happened in a story. I make these videos to explore what that story means, to get past the simple question of what events transpired, and dig into what I think are the far more important questions. Why did they happen? What ideas drive them? And what is the story trying to communicate through them? So more often than not, I try to avoid any trace of theory making in these videos, because that's not what they're about. They'd probably get more views if they were, but it's not what I want to do. Even when a game has abstractions in its story, open ends in its conclusions, I want to find meaning in them rather than try to explain them away. But sometimes the abstractions leave a gap of meaning, and there are multiple ways to try and fill them in, each of which change the way we perceive the game's message. And I believe this is one such case, because it's hard not to come to the canonical ending and wonder, why on earth would Mio kill Mayu? The most evident explanation is just that she got caught up in what was going on, with the hellish abyss yawning before her and the priests rhythmically banging their sticks on the ground and her sister so insistently pleading with her to kill her. But that's hard for me to swallow. Mio clearly feels very protective of her sister due to the guilt of having indirectly caused her injury as a child. It's easy to conclude this just from seeing her character and actions throughout the story, but the game also demonstrates this through its structure. Mio is always moving toward Mayu, always trying to find her, and the player progresses based on that single goal. There's only one opportunity the game offers the player to change this about Mio, when Mayu is taken near the end and the player can choose to leave without her. But this opportunity happens before the canonical ending, meaning that by the time she kills her in the sacrifice, Mio has already rejected the possibility of leaving without Mayu. The idea that Mio could just be pressured into murdering her own sister doesn't sit right with me, even before she snaps out of it and starts freaking out and apologizing through sobbing tears, further indicating that this just wasn't something she would have done. But there is another explanation. Just as Mayu is being possessed by Sae, perhaps Yae is also possessing Mio. Literally, the first ghost Mio sees is that of Yae, crying over the ruins of the village after returning too late to save her sister. Then, the first ghost the twins encounter, Miyako, attacks Mio because she mistakes her for Yae. Throughout the game, Mayu is being led by Sae toward the hellish abyss to complete the ritual, but Mio needs no such direct guidance because her priority is being with Mayu anyway. What's more, it's clear Yae's spirit is present and active because she lets Mayu through the door to the hellish abyss, just as Sae lets Mio in. And in the Promise ending, exclusive to the Xbox port, Yae's spirit straight up walks out of Mio's body to reunite with Sae. That's right, I'm breaking two rules here, theory crafting and considering a re-release. I'd be lying if I said that didn't make me a little uncomfortable, but as I said before, they're my rules and I can break them if I want to. And I genuinely think that considering this alternate ending and presuming Mio to be possessed by Yae gives us a lot more to work with, not just because I think it makes the most sense, but because I think it creates the most meaning. After all, Sae's motivation is fairly easy to grasp. On a surface level, we could say she's trying to get the twins to successfully enact the ritual in hopes that it will end the purgatorial state of the village and its inhabitants, but I think it's clear Sae isn't really thinking like that. Her quest isn't born of a practical desire, but of an angry, vengeful hatred. Her twin sister left her in the village to this fate, and she'll stop at nothing to act out how things should have gone, and punish another twin in Yae's place if she can't. This is a very personal vendetta for her. It's also a twisted mirror of Mio and Mayu's own relationship. Mio's easy willingness to leave Mayu behind as children resulted not only in insecurity on Mayu's part, but even a lasting injury. And this has put strain on their relationship as Mayu clings unhealthily to her sister and Mio wrestles silently with guilt over her part in that accident. Just different trauma responses to having left behind by their siblings. And with all this in perspective, it gives us a sense of Yae's motivation as well, to make up for betraying her sister before by rejoining her and completing the ritual. In the canonical ending, this meant possessing Mio, using her to complete the ritual with Mayu so that not only was the village freed, but Yae and Sae have finally been joined in the manner they were always meant to be. It's a way to reunite with her sister and atone for what her actions put her through, even if it means one last pair of innocents suffers for it. But aside from strongly supporting the idea that Yae was possessing Mio, the Promise ending from the Xbox version also adds more support for this interpretation of Yae's motivations, along with a nice alternate conclusion to their story. We actually see the two reconcile, see Yae reunite with Sae and apologize for not coming back for her in time. They complete the ritual, but together this time, and more strongly than the ritual ever allowed the twins to be, forming a butterfly not in the absence of a twin, but in the togetherness of both. They still care little for Mayu's life, because this isn't a noble thing either of them are doing. It's purely about each other. But in doing so, and with Mio's saving of her sister, we come to a much more satisfying conclusion in which both sets of twins are able to reconcile the tension between them. I'm not going to treat this as the ending through which we interpret the game's meaning, because it's not. That would be a mistake. For one, it's not the canonical conclusion of the events of the game, but more importantly, from a thematic perspective, it would be a mistake to treat any one ending as the only one through which we interpret the story. They all form a larger picture and contribute to the game's overall meaning. And it's finally time to talk about it. It shouldn't come as a surprise that one of the major themes tying everything together in Fatal Frame 2 is togetherness, or perhaps more accurately, the lack thereof. It's present in pretty much every arc of the game, and most of the characters here are responding in some way to the loss of someone that they're close to, or at the very least, the threat of losing them. The very first hostile ghost we encounter is of a woman who came searching for her fiancé, only for his ghost to come and kill her. Akane Kiryu missed her twin sister Azami so much after performing the ritual that her father crafted a doll in her likeness, but Akane's sorrow invited a spirit into the doll, and such a hostile one that Azami's spirit herself came to her father and said it wasn't needed and had to be destroyed. Itsuki loved his brother so much that the ritual failed because of it, and living with the guilt of what he did, compounded by the fact that the justification for it didn't even come about, was basically what set the whole plot in motion by motivating him to get Yae and Sae out before they suffered the same fate. Meanwhile, Itsuki's sister Chitose loved and depended on her older brother so much that she died waiting for him during the repentance. Even Yae and Sae's father is a remaining, having killed his own twin brother in a ritual long ago, and expresses hesitance to put his daughters through the same thing he went through. One of the things that makes Fatal Frame 2's narrative a little more clearly and easily readable than the first game is just how defined each of these stories are. Most of them have their own segment entirely dedicated to telling them, so compared to the relatively vague and intertwining backstories of the original, the story comes across a lot more clearly, and each of these smaller stories contribute to one major overall point. It is better to be with the people we love, and any force that tries to convince us to do otherwise is lying to us. It's a simple thematic premise, but one effectively communicated through each of these stories of people who were traumatically separated from their loved ones by this village's cruel customs. And each of these stories is a compelling ghost story in its own right. The story of Akane and the doll is particularly creepy and demonstrates the way aggrieved actions on the part of the living dishonored the memory and spirits of the dead. And there's nothing in either game so far nearly as tragic as realizing that the ghost of Chitose isn't even trying to hurt Mio. She just died afraid and alone and desperately needs someone to comfort her. These people were told that this separation was necessary, even good, and more than that, they were told that separating themselves actually was togetherness, that their souls would become one, and that was more valuable than simply existing alongside each other, than being with each other. In every case the game shows us, that was a lie, and these people suffered for it until this system of ritualistic sacrifice collapsed under its own barbaric weight. Which is where we get to the other major theme this all points to: trauma. Specifically, inherited trauma, the trauma that we pass on to others through misguided notions of tradition and necessity. This is the main thematic difference between the first game and the second. While they both assert through the modern storyline that past wrongs must be uncovered and made right, the first game did a bizarre 180 on the evil of the rituals by affirming their necessity in the end, while this one far more strongly suggests that the rituals should have stopped in the first place. It agrees with the first game about making right the wrongs of the past, but adds that past wrongs must not be used to justify current ones. The whole system of All Gods Village and its rituals fell apart because the collective trauma of those forced to partake in it became too great. The twins escaped because Itsuki hoped to spare them the same pain he went through, and in the end things only turned out as badly as they did because even Sae had fallen to the belief that this was good and necessary, and they should not run away from it. And while they don't contribute directly to the events that brought about the village's demise, the story of the Kiryus and of the twins' father punctuate this nicely. The dollmaker asserts that if only these rituals hadn't happened, his daughter would not have lost her spirit. And it's clear that even the village elder did not want his daughters to undergo the same trauma he had, and his hesitations cost the twins and the village dearly. The system functioned on the backs of murdered and traumatized children, and eventually, their backs gave out. In the face of such overwhelming cruelty, they inevitably revolted, and the whole thing just came tumbling down. And I think the game agrees with me when I say, it should have. I'm not going to claim I know everything about how the Hellgate works, but it's never suggested in any of the endings that the fate of the world is at stake, not even on the level of the previous game. In one of the original endings, the ritual is straight up not completed, and once the dam is built, the village just sits peacefully underwater, no indication of any consequences for the lack of twins to satiate the Hellgate's hunger. It seems that only the village stood to lose anything should the Hellgate remain unsated, which I think is very much the point. It was only for the sake of its own preservation that the village did all of this, and a society built on the perpetration of such cruel acts cannot and should not continue. It would eventually crumble under the weight of its own sins, as indeed it did. But of course, even after the violent death of this terrible tradition, the trauma it caused lived on. The whole village went on and on, reliving the trauma of those final days. From the Kiryu twins and their father reliving the horrific aftermath of their ritual, to the villagers still searching for Yae in the eternal night, to poor Chitose Tachibana still crying and calling for her brother, the events of so many years ago are anything but over. The consequences for this kind of cruelty never stop with the cruelty itself. Trauma lasts far beyond the event that caused it, reaching out into the lives of those it touched and the people around them, maybe even dragging others into it, unless it's faced head-on, understood, and given closure. And this is why, despite the canonical ending being very similar to that of the first game, I like this ending a lot more. The first game's alternate ending was used to suggest that the canonical one was not just how things were, but how things should be. In Fatal Frame 2, the canonical ending is how things turned out, but it wasn't the ideal end state for All Gods Village or the characters involved in it. The other endings serve to offer better outcomes by fleshing out exactly what both pairs of twins needed to process their own trauma and move on together. In Sae, we're given a picture of a twin murdered alone, seemingly abandoned by her beloved sister, driven mad by a torturous afterlife and the consequences of their failed ritual, simply lashing out for need of closure. If the backstory is about harmful systems perpetrating themselves on more and more people over time, Sae is the very embodiment of that concept. She exists to reenact her trauma through the lives of other people, and in the canonical ending of the game, she succeeds in doing so. But in the alternate ending of the original game, Sae is instead driven from Mayu's body, and Mio gives her sight to save her sister. A sacrificial, if not entirely necessary, act that makes both twins more dependent on each other. It's a tragic ending in its own sense, but there's a satisfying symmetry to Mio disabling herself in order to save Mayu, as a form of atonement for the guilt she's faced for her sister's own disability, and in doing so guarantee that they'll always be together, supporting each other. But it leaves Sae's own story incomplete, which is why I think the Xbox ending is worth consideration for offering closure on that front. It shows Yae coming back to Sae in atonement for abandoning her, and the two finally go to the afterlife together. The original tradition called for one to go and one to stay behind, and the trauma of the act created a crimson butterfly, a literal imprint of the ritual's violence and trauma. But when the girls go together, the butterfly is made not from their violent separation, but from their union. They create it through togetherness, rather than being apart. The end result is that, like the first game, Fatal Frame 2 addresses the trauma of its ghostly antagonist in a way that makes her relatable, that treats her as a person who deserves healing and closure. But to its credit, and unlike the first game, it manages to do so while still wholeheartedly, unquestionably condemning the cruelties that led to that trauma to begin with. So while the game's canonical ending may not offer this closure, it's just one small part of a bigger picture that does. That shows that it's possible to overcome this trauma and reaffirms that it was indeed wrong of the village to continue inflicting it. Things may not have canonically worked out for Mio and Mayu, but we have a compelling reason why, and even multiple scenarios showing how, perhaps, it could have turned out better. This is a story of people who love and rely on each other, but whose affection was perverted by violent traditions and twisted reasoning that put distance between them, until even that affection itself became violent. The only solution is to restore that togetherness, and even then, the only way Sae knows how to do this is by inflicting the rituals on another person. But the further outside of those rituals we go, the more we reject the very premise of their necessity and ultimate goodness, the more these characters are able to achieve that togetherness and heal from the trauma of separation. And thus, Fatal Frame 2 manages to improve on its predecessor in what was, for me at least, the most important way it could, by telling a story that, while tragic, doesn't rely on that tragedy to carry its horror at the cost of the depth and meaning of its story. It is instead a terrifying and emotive exploration of trauma, separation, and how we respond to the harm inflicted on us. What can I say? There's a reason so many consider this the greatest horror game ever made.